implementing config manager role-based security. So I'm guessing that last nugget sort of melted your brain off. Honestly, you're due for something easy after that. That was a lot of stuff. And I had to go through it quickly because if I slowed down, it would have been 3 hours instead of an hour. So, sorry about that. In return for your patience in that last nugget, this one I present to you as something that's relatively easy. In fact, this will be a fairly short nugget in comparison with some of the other ones. In this nugget, we're going to talk about security. And this security, at least in relation to Config Manager, has gotten a bit of an overhaul between 07 and 12. In pretty much every previous version of Config Manager, the security just bit. It was awful. And it was easy, it was remarkably easy to create situations where people had access to things that they shouldn't, but it was very difficult for you to track it down. So Microsoft has been really they've really embraced the whole notion of role-based security. And that's a good thing. There is a bit of a mind shift. You have to kind of refactor your brain to make it work from the old way of doing things more towards the role-based way of doing things. You see this in Exchange. You see this now in Config Manager. You even see it in SQL in certain circumstances. Now, the Config Manager implementation of role-based security is by no means as ridiculous as it was back in Exchange 2010. But by shifting to role-based security and this notion of roles, scopes, and collections, it actually works, and it's fairly intuitive in the way it works, but at the same time it's very flexible. And all you have to really remember is this, that the roles constitute the what, and that the scopes and collections constitute the where. So a role is what actions are you allowed to do? Okay, are you allowed to view things? Are you allowed to change things? Are you allowed to delete things? And then one step deeper, are you allowed to view collections? Are you allowed to change collections? Are you allowed to delete deployments? With that in mind, of all the things that you're allowed to do, then the scope or the collection then defines where you get to do it. So a scope can be everything. A scope can be just specific collections or specific items, specific deployments, for example. Now, the whole notion here is that this whole role-based framework is designed to facilitate what we call the separation of duties. Okay, it's a very academic term, but the notion of separation of duties is in a big config manager infrastructure, one that spans the world. There are certain people that should be able to do certain things and not other things. Like your asset management people should be able to perhaps view and maybe even create reports, but they should have no privileges to do any kind of deployments. More specifically, or even more granular than that, you might give people the ability to deploy things, but not to create the packages. Or vice versa. You might have other groups of people that are just packagers. You don't want them deploying stuff, but you want to give them the ability to add package metadata and application metadata for later deployment by other people. So this whole notion of separation of duties is really important, because at the end of the day, it's what's going to allow you to scale your config manager infrastructure to meet the needs of a very large environment. Now, in 2012, your administrators did not actually obtain their permissions directly. They get their permissions through their assigned security roles. Okay, so what are they allowed to do? And then the scopes and collections the role is assigned to. Okay, the what and where. And interestingly enough, Config Manager still follows access-based enumeration in that different people are only going to be able to see the objects that they have permission to manage in the Config Manager console. So if you remove something, they can't see it, and it won't be there distracting them all the time. So in this nugget, we're going to spend just a couple of minutes talking about how you set up security roles and what they can do, and how you can create your own security scopes, and then also how you would work with collection security. It's kind of funny. If you look at the documentation, it talks about all these roles and scopes, then it says, and then collections are different. And you kind of wonder why you would separate out collections, but it actually makes a bit of sense. There are different buttons you're going to click whenever you're dealing with collection security, and just figuring out where they are. If you listen to this nugget, you'll get kind of a leg up on the massive amount of scratching your head because you can't find the little padlock icon on your collections. So let's spend a minute or two talking about these different security items here on our config manager server and how they might work. So here under security, I have essentially different items that I can configure. First of all are the people themselves. These are the administrative users, the people that are going to have some part to play in your config manager infrastructure. And I can add additional administrative users if I want. They come right out of Active Directory. Okay, if I hit the browse button here, it'll bring up the Active Directory browse contents. And then from there, once I've identified who this person is, then I can further kind of scope them down based off of existing security scopes and collections that are in the environment. So by default, there's one security scope, there's actually two, that come right out of the box. One is default, the other is everything. And there are two collections available out of the box, all systems and user groups. So let's just, instead of creating a new user here, let's just work with my user account here, because you can take a look. Well, on my user account, the user account is where you do almost all of the actual permissions assignment. Okay, so even though the intro said you don't directly assign permissions, they come through scopes, it's on that user where you do the assignment. So here under security roles, I can choose one of the 14 or so different security roles that exist that I can deploy to this user. Remember, these are the actions you're allowed to accomplish. And if I figure out that, well, this is a security person and they're an asset manager and they're actually building applications, well, then I can give them the roles that they need. Then under security scopes is where I associate the person's name, right? The concept I think of as Greg Shields, to the different scopes that I've defined where that person can accomplish the tasks that I've allowed them to accomplish. Right, so it can be everywhere, okay, and that'll be everywhere that's assigned to the role. Or I can do specific instances that are assigned to the role. So maybe I don't want all the all security scope. Maybe I want a subset of that, which would be some other security scope that I would create. Okay, this is where you start to get a little granular with things. Then down here on the bottom is where I can assign security roles with scopes and collections. Okay, so I am assigned a full admin. Let me go ahead and edit the full admin's, what it can touch from this location. So this is where things get a little confusing. I show you that first, because if I don't show you that first and we come over here to roles and especially scopes, you're going to go, well, where the heck do I actually make changes to this stuff? So here under security roles, again, roles are the what. What am I allowed to do? For an application administrator, if I right-click and choose properties, you'll notice here are the users. Notice there's nothing to do here. I can't actually change anything. And then here are their permissions. Because this is an out-of-the-box one, I can't go and adjust stuff here. But if I wanted to create my own, I do so by copying an existing one and giving it a different name. So my custom security role. I can't spell today. Once I do that, then I can go about adjusting the perms here to change things for this role. Notice again, just actions that I'm worried about. So for distribution points, what are the actions that a person could conceivably do against a distribution point, or for a driver package, or for inventory reports, so on and so forth. So that creates the security role. I've done nothing yet about assigning it any kind of a scope. Down here for scopes, once again, scopes are exclusively the where. Where can I do stuff? If I want to create a new security scope, then I'll call this my custom security scope. Well, wait a minute. How do I actually wait a minute, why don't I do anything here? There's nothing associated with the scope here in this location. I just give it a name and then potentially who wants to be in there, but even after I create it, I can't do anything. That seems weird. All these, it's funny because you and I both know that there needs to be another tab in here so I can do things here. But in these role-based authentication model, I just got done doing the VMware View and their role-based security. And you want to talk about just not making sense in one's brain. All of these role-based security things just seem like they're missing certain tabs. Anyway, off soapbox. Once I create the scope, in order to populate the scope with items that are then securable, I need to go and find those items somewhere in the hierarchy. So let's say here under Application Management for packages, I want to say this app vClient. I'm going to set its security scope, or I'm going to tag it with this custom security scope item here and click OK. So now if I've assigned my user account that scope, well then that person can actually do whatever actions they need to accomplish against that piece. You have to kind of go out into the world and find the items that you intend to secure and then secure them with this little padlock whenever it appears. And when it does, I'm going to assign it to the scope to know that it's eventually going to filter its way back to whoever that user is. If I go back here, take a look at the custom security scope and view the properties on it, notice there's still not much there to be able to be seen. So figuring this stuff out gets a little bit challenging when you're trying to identify what you want to assign. Now back here under the user, if I go back to properties, it is here where I can then add that security scope in so that the user has access to the items that are secured with that scope. Does this make sense? Well, hopefully it does, because I'm about to change everything. Okay, so, all right, so I've made this change here. Let me now go back to a special kind of situation, which would be actually up here under collections. And under collections, I want to take a look at the collection I created here and add it to a scope. Oh, wait a minute, no scopes here. If I choose properties and security, wait, I don't have any scopes here either. Wait a minute, how do I actually go about dealing with collection security if there's no padlock here in order to accomplish this? Well, here's where things kind of get a little different. Back under administration and back under, let's go back here to the user again as an example. Under the scopes that exist, notice how some of these are of type security scope and others are of type collection. In this, with this GUI, you don't actually assign security from the collection. You assign it again back from the user. So if I go here to click Add and I choose Collection, I can go to my device collections and see there's the collection I want to apply for this particular user. And that's how I end up kind of filtering things down between these users and the scopes for everything else and the collections for collection security. That's really it, honestly. There's not much to talk about here in relation to implementing security, because we just have these three items that we kind of have to focus on, four if you count the user themselves. And as long as everything sort of maps together, well, then I know I've got the right security items deployed for users. So what have we talked about in this short and mildly frustrating nugget? We've talked about role-based security. Admittedly, even with the mild annoyances that we have where things aren't in places where you would think they should be, well, the 2012 flexible role-based security framework is still better than it was back in 2007. It's just, when you spend more time with it, it makes more sense. And it is less problematic for you to assign things. It makes it difficult for you to find them a little bit later. As long as you keep in your mind that roles equals what and scopes and collections equal where, well, then you're going to do just fine. The notion here, as I said, is intended to facilitate that separation of duties, and we apply those permissions through the roles and through the scopes that those users are assigned to. And all importantly is that when I do assign things to maybe semi-technical or non-technical people, they're not going to have access to see the stuff that they shouldn't see. We then spend a few minutes actually creating and working with some security roles, scopes, and also just a little bit having to do with collection security. So coming up in the next nugget, we're going to take The next one is actually the final nugget. And so what we're going to do is we're going to fracture this entire environment. So the whole config manager infrastructure that we've built up to this point, we are going to flush it. Because if you recall, back when we were talking about the installation nugget, in order for us to create a site that has more than one server, I have to start with 2. And I didn't start with 2, I started with 1 purposely. In that next nugget, you're going to learn why it makes sense to start with 2 servers in your config manager infrastructure. But until then, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.